Everybody see that screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start off my workshop with a story about Fred Craddock. And I'm going to share the story in light of the early part of my workshop is going to be a little bit about language and some of the language of the actual title of the workshop. But I was at an event where Fred Craddock was preaching, and the title of his sermon, it says, "Shall we preach the R word again?" And it was an interesting sermon. The whole sermon was on the word of repentance. And can we preach repentance anymore? And one of the things that Fred Craddock talked about in that sermon of repentance was some people's imagery of repentance was of people going up to doors and knocking on doors and asking people if they're ready to commit their life to Christ. And there's kind of this antsiness about repentance. But he also shared that if we lost that word, if we lost the word repentance, if it had such a negative connotation to it, that we would lose a pretty important word in our faith tradition. That some words take on some negative energy over time. And if we allow those words to be lost within the vocabulary of our church, we lose a great deal of who we are as a people of faith. Mm-hmm. So I think that was just an interesting piece. So I'm going to offer up the idea of what comes to mind when you hear the word stewardship in the context of the church. If people want to share a response or a quick thought, when you hear the word stewardship, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
Somebody's fixed to hit me up for some money.
Yep. Anybody else?
I just simply think of it as caring for, taking care of, or being a caregiver for.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
The other thing I think
generosity.
Generosity. Yep.
I think of resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say that in my experience, I'll get all kinds of responses on stewardship from money. First thing that comes to mind, I would say 80% of the people I would say would probably be in the money range. If it's something about I'm going to be asked for something, I'm being asked to make a pledge of some kind in some way. There is the stewardship side of caregiving or something related to the environment. And so many people, if someone says the preacher is going to do a stewardship sermon, Joey Jeter, who was a homiletics professor of mine, said oftentimes when there was going to be a stewardship sermon, a person that used to lean forward all of a sudden would start leaning back and on the pew whenever they heard stewardship sermon was coming. Oh, here they come and talk about money, talk about giving, want me to make a contribution in some way. And so the language of stewardship and the use of that word becomes really important. And so it's not so much what we think of the word as what the listener thinks of that word, and then how that word is defined within a context or a community with one another. So just like Fred Craddock shared with the shall we preach the R word again, if we lose the word stewardship from our vocabulary, what does the church lose by that word going away? If we ever thought about losing words in our faith tradition, but if stewardship all of a sudden was extracted or pulled out of our vocabulary in the life of the church, what would we lose? And I'll just kind of open it up, see if there's any responses people have in terms of what we would lose with that word no longer being with us.
Good morning, Chris. It's Allison. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, that's fabulous. And now I forgot what I was going to say, but I think it had to do with if stewardship were extracted from our vocabulary, I think that our call to commitment would be watered down.
No, that's good.
Because when I hear the word stewardship, I think of commitment. So if we were to lose that, I think it would just lose, yeah, the commitment. That's
Yeah.
all I have.
Yep, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
That's helpful.
And this is DC from Louisiana. I was just thinking that's a great point that Allison just made, but coming as a person who is just now coming into my own as following my calling to become a pastor, coming from a layperson's perspective, we almost have to reteach what stewardship is, because for so long in many churches, it's only meant, you only hear about stewardship when it's time to sign the pledge card, you know, and there's so much more to what stewardship is. And that's probably what you're going to talk about later, but
Yeah, that's good. That's good thought. That's good thought. Yep. I'm going to jump into some key words
this
for us. And that's really comes from the title of the workshop, is Authentic Spirituality and Stewardship. And we just kind of break those words down. Authentic is basically something or someone that is genuine. You know, one of the things we appreciate is authenticity in people, or authenticity in experiences. It makes it feels real. It feels genuine. It feels like this is something significant we want to be a part of. Kind of a broad definition of spirituality is a way of life that draws us closer to God's presence, or maybe another way of thinking about it is something bigger than ourselves that inspires our beliefs and actions. That spirituality is belief in more than me. It's a belief that something bigger than me is at work in the world, inviting me into that world to act, to believe, to inspire. And I think of stewardship in a very basic definition of stewardship is the process of acting on behalf of another. I think we could go back as early as the creation story in Genesis, where God charges humanity. And I think this word is wrongly used a lot of ways, but charges us to have dominion over the earth, not domination over the earth, but a caretaking of the earth. We are an ambassador for God on earth and taking care of all that God has created. So you kind of blend these three words together of a genuine, something that's genuine, something that draws us to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, and acting and caring for something other than ourselves is really important. So I wanted those words to kind of be out there as kind of some baseline words for us to think about in terms of what it means to have an understanding of stewardship that has authenticity in it, and also has a depth of spirituality within it. And so the authentic spirituality of stewardship, to me, is God believing in us, that God believes in our capabilities. I don't think we would be created unless God felt like we had the ability to do significant things in the world, to make an impact in the world, to make a difference in the lives of those around us, to take care of the world that God called us to live in, to take care of all the plants and the animals and the environments and the communities and the people, the differences and the diversities that exist all across our globe, that God believes in us to do good things, to make a difference. If we pay attention to culture, we'd have the opposite belief. It's divisive, it's segregated, there's disparaging levels of incomes, of resources, of the 7 billion people, 7 billion plus people that live in the world. There's about 3 billion people of the 7 billion that make no more than $5 a day. I mean, it's just amazing to think of the disparity of economic realities in our world. To me, being a steward is not just knowing that reality, making that reality no longer exist, that we should live in a world that has a better sense of equity of people around the world, that God believes in us to do this work. So a few things I have here are stewardship redefined. And so these are some basic things I want to lift up in terms of some basic, I would call 4 tenets of how we redefine the word stewardship. And I think the first one is probably the most important one I have down here. Stewardship is something we are and not something that we do. That's not to say that stewardship isn't things that we do, but it's not the beginning place. Stewardship begins with what I basically call a way of being or a way of living. And then if you are stewardship, then everything you do is stewardship. Stewardship is not one act of our life, it is every act of our life. And so with that in mind, stewardship becomes a mindset before it's an action. Stewardship is at its minimum level, filling out a pledge card. At its maximum level, stewardship is making an impact on the world on God's behalf to make the world a better place. And if we embody that mindset, then everything we do, every interaction we have with an individual, every step we take on the planet makes a difference. It's not a simple one-time act. I think of stewardship as a way of life, not a checkoff list. Well, I did my recycling today. I can check off being a steward. I can move on. Stewardship is everything that we do, every breath we take, every action that we have. Stewardship is a reflection of who we are as a person. I think God would have us say that we are ambassadors on the earth on God's behalf. We are representatives of God. When I was in youth ministry many years ago, I had an activity called the Great Mall Adventure, when it was a cool thing to go to a mall. It's not necessarily cool to go to the mall anymore, but went to the mall and had the kids go around and see what they would observe about people they would notice in the mall. I had them kind of make a list of all the people they noticed at the mall. And we'd come back to the church and talk about what they noticed. And one kid said, well, I saw an athlete at the mall today. Well, how do you know that was an athlete? Well, he had big muscles, the outfit he was wearing, and or I saw a cowboy at the mall today. Well, how do you know you saw a cowboy? Well, I saw boots and a hat. And so they talked about all the obvious visual indicators of how we might identify someone. And we got done with all their lists of people they saw. I asked them if any of them had seen a Christian. Well, how are you supposed to find that? How are you supposed to identify that? And I think that's one of the big challenges. I think stewardship is a lot like that, in that when someone sees us, are we being a steward of what God has entrusted us to do? Would someone say, I am a steward of the church. I am a steward of the faith? Would people recognize that in us? Is there any distinguishable thing about ourselves that some would notice that they are distinctly Christian or even a steward of what God has done in the world? So there's this entrustment on God's part for our participation in the world on God's behalf. So those are, I think, some stewardship defining pieces that I think are important to me. So if we kind of define stewardship with these four statements, then how do we move in this direction would be the next thing. A few years ago, I was at an event with the Lilly Foundation in Indianapolis, and it was an event on giving and faith and stewardship. And one of the speakers, one of the keynote speakers, did a talk on a theology of sufficiency. And I thought that was such a great phrase. I'd never heard that phrase until a few years ago. The phrases I typically heard was a theology of scarcity and a theology of abundance. And a theology of scarcity means there's only so much to go around, so I better get mine before someone else gets it from me. That's essentially a theology of scarcity. There's a limited supply. And so if we're all trying to have access to the limited supply and there's only so much to go around, it seems like the first person that gets it, or the person that is in the right place at the right time can get it, then other people are left out in the mix. And so much of our current culture functions under a theology of scarcity. There's only so much around, and I want to make sure I get my piece of the pie. Typically in church world, we have functioned under a theology of abundance, which basically said there's more than enough to go around and more than enough that there's enough resources to share. And so just using the mindset of hunger in the world. Of course, there are places where there is hardly any food available for people. And then there's places around the world where there is more food. We throw away more food than the United States is probably the worst at this, as we probably dispose of more food than any other nation in the world. And the disposed of food could easily feed the world. And so there is plenty of food to go around, but it just needs to be kind of shared in some way. A theology of sufficiency kind of takes into heart a theology of abundance, but it pairs it back a little bit. A theology of sufficiency says, there is plenty to go around. I will only take what is sufficient for my life, and the rest is to be shared with other people. So it's not that there's just abundance of stuff and how do we get it moved around. Is I'm going to be intentional about what's important in my life and making sure that others receive as well. And so I think sufficiency takes abundance a little more seriously and more equitably in our society. And so a theology of sufficiency is one of not only knowing there's enough, but being a kind of a guardian of myself, of how much is enough for me. Is sometimes it's too much. And so we have to be kind of our own critics of what is sufficient for our lives, and recognizing that what we have is far greater than what most people have, and what we have should be shared in greater abundance with others out of our own resources. And so theology of sufficiency has been probably in the last 2 to 3 years, a newer mindset for me in terms of thinking about what it means to be a steward of what God has given to me. That in many cases, it means me living with less. And me living with less is much easier than I would give myself credit to think. We can move around a lot of stuff in our life. We are blessed in more ways than we can count in terms of what we have in our life. And we can share out of our own resources. We can do with a lot less than we currently have. I think that's an important piece to know. This is a little piece I think that's important too, in terms of expanding our stewardship mindset. So I've got stewardship in the middle, and I've got these 6 little bubbles around in a circle. And all 6 of these words are different facets of the word stewardship. That we are a steward of creation. We are a steward of our time. We are a steward of ourselves. We are a steward of Sabbath. We are a steward of our community. We are a steward of our resources. And so I have tried to extrapolate stewardship out in smaller parts to help people get a better understanding of this word, because stewardship sometimes is relegated to a particular worldview in terms of maybe it's just money, or maybe it's a steward is taking care of the world. But stewardship is far more encompassing than what we typically think of stewardship to mean. And so these 6 words have helped me kind of shape and broaden my own reflecting on what stewardship means in the life of my own life, as well as the life of the community of faith of which I'm a part. I mean, you can take each of these words and kind of reflect on them in some meaningful way. I can just start with stewardship of self. Is how do I take care of myself? Do I take time off? Do I exercise? Do I eat well? Do I surround myself with people that nurture me and lift me up and encourage me? Do I have someone that's like a mentor or a spiritual director, or someone that gives guidance to my life, that helps me think about me, that I can be my best self in this world? It's hard to be a caretaker of someone else when you're not even a caretaker of yourself. We oftentimes will think, well, I'll take care of others and I'll worry about me later. It's a both and, it's not an either or. And so that's just kind of one piece. Stewarding of our time. How do we use our time? Our culture demands us to be a nonstop 24/7 society. And we have to be a protector of our time. Time for myself, time for my family, time for my friends, time for my church, time for work and production, time to rest. I mean, how we think about our time and how we use our time is so important. Brian Fail, who was a longtime mentor and friend of me in ministry, said, we have to control our time or our time controls us. And he used the example of, at least in ministry, it's been true for me, that the church can absorb all your time if you let it as a pastor. You can let the church take all your time from you if you want to. Or if you do that, then you minimize the role of your family by doing that. And so Brian used to, he had the old timey little handheld calendar, and he would schedule in his calendar time for his wife and kids in his calendar. And someone came up and says, Brian, can you meet me for a meeting on Tuesday night? He'd look at his calendar and says, no, I've got a commitment. I can't do that on Tuesday night. He said, no one else needs to know what that commitment is, but you know it's a commitment to your child or to your wife or to your spouse or to your loved one. And so when you start governing your time, it shapes how you think about your life and how you spend it. And so each of these 6 bubbles around stewardship is a different facet of stewardship in terms of how we think about it. Each of these things I would say is a journey. We never arrive, well, I have finally got stewardship of self figured out. I'm going to move up to the other 5. And we never figure out in totality any of these 6 words. They are an ongoing journey of discovery. And about the time you figure out self, 6 months later, you've got to rediscover self again. Some radical event happens. All of a sudden, you and your spouse are doing just fine. Life's great. You understand your sense of self and your spouse really well. And then all of a sudden, you have to go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you've got cancer. Well, your whole sense of understanding self has been radically changed. You got to reevaluate all over again. Life has a way of helping us redefine life when we least expect it. And so stewardship in all these facets is an ongoing journey rather than an arrival. We are constantly reflecting on these words of what it means to be a steward in God's world. So I'm going to stop there for a second and just see if people have any observations or thoughts about this little model that's on the screen.
Yeah, this is Steve Thompson. Yeah, I like the model. I guess one of the things that occurs to me as you talk about stewardship, that it really goes beyond just individual responsibility, also has to do with corporate responsibility. One of the things many churches, especially the Christian church or mainline churches in general, are experiencing are buildings that they can't sustain anymore. And the reality is many of these are off of the tax rolls. Orleans Parish, for example, in New Orleans, 60% of the properties are off the tax rolls, paying no taxes to support any community services. And consequently, it compromises the ability to meet the needs of people in the community. I think there's a serious question of stewardship for us owning buildings and looking at other models.
Yep, very much so. And I would put that in the little bubble of community and resources. I mean, I think you could kind of look at it in terms of those two things together in terms of how a church thinks about its life and connection to its surrounding community, what resources the building has to serve the greater good, and how that works. I think that's really important. So stewardship is beyond an individual ethic. It is a communal ethic from its very get-go, I think. I think that's right. Other thoughts? Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So these next few slides I have are, I'm going to go back. Let's see, let me go backwards. Here we go. These next few are some steps that I'm thinking of, personal steps toward an authentic spirituality and stewardship. One of those would be allowing these 6 concepts that I talk about to be practiced with regularity in your life. Is how do I begin to allow these different understandings of stewardship to be a regular part of my life, not something I tend to every once in a while. And so to me, this is that shifting of stewardship is something I do to stewardship is something I am. And the more these words become part of the fabric of my being, then over time, I become a steward rather than doing stewardship. I think along with that is the spiritual practice of prayer. I'm a firm believer that prayer is a grounding discipline, not only for an individual, but a grounding discipline for the church. When we pray, we become stronger as a person. When we pray, we become stronger as a community. And I think prayer is an important piece. So I think when we pray, it's different from when you think about something versus praying about something. When you pray about something, you're actually inviting vulnerability of self with God. And when you are vulnerable with God, you become more open to how God might use you. And so it could be saying in that prayer, God, how can I be a more faithful steward today? How can I best use my resources, God? How can I pay attention to caring for creation? How can I best use my time, oh God? And so it's more invitational in a prayer model to make yourself vulnerable and pray of how God might want me to live my life today. The other piece I would say in this personal step is in the invite section, is inviting others into your journey of stewardship, is having an accountability partner or a stewardship partner. It's one thing to say, I'm going to read this book in a month, and you may or may not read that book. But if you're going to be reading a book along with someone, if you do a book study with someone else and you have a date of we're going to read the book by, we're more inclined to read the book if we have an accountability partner than if I don't. And so I think it's important to have partners with us in this work of stewardship. And part of that's for my own personal journey of being a better steward. If I've got someone I can dialogue with about stewardship on a regular basis, I'm much better off than me just thinking it in my own mind. I need to be a better steward. But if I've got a conversation partner to reflect on stewardship together, we're both going to be better off by that conversation and not just me. And so there's a nice part about personal development of stewardship in an authentic way when we invite others. We can consider it a prayer partner or a dialogue partner. If your person likes to go walking, I like to go walking in the neighborhood. Well, maybe you need to find a walking partner. It's amazing the kind of conversations you can have on a walk in 30 minutes with someone than just walking by yourself. And maybe that conversation with your, I call it a stewardship partner, but imagine the conversation you've had to walk with that person once a week for 30 minutes. 52 weeks of 30 minutes talking about stewardship is going to make a huge difference in your life in terms of being a more authentic steward in the world. And so those little steps, I think, can make a difference. They sound simple, but if you look at the broadened definition of stewardship and the 6 concepts, you invite regular prayer about that, and then you invite other people into the journey with you. It makes a huge impact in terms of your own sense of what stewardship means in your life. So then I'm going to take it the next step. I'm going to talk about congregational level stuff here and steps in the congregation. So the first one I have is allow a stewardship to be more than only a giving campaign, but strengthen how an annual campaign is facilitated. And so I'll show an example in a minute, but one of the things is instead of allowing your stewardship campaign to be about financial pledges, allow your financial campaign to be bigger than that and broader than that every year, rather than just what monetary gifts are being pledged for the next year. The other thing I would say in a congregation is using the word stewardship more broadly throughout the year. Don't just relegate stewardship to a season of giving, which is for most churches, it's October, November. You're going to hear the typical minister stewardship sermon in October, November. We're going to give the importance of giving, everyone turn in their pledges so we can make plans for the next year. All those things are important, but stewardship, if it's going to have a lasting impact, has to be more than an annual or seasonal approach. It has to be used throughout the year. The other thing I would say is use stewardship as a describer to enhance ministry rather than an identified ministry. In most structures of churches, we have a stewardship committee or a stewardship ministry. Do most churches have something kind of like that? I would guess you probably do. But what if we use language of how do I steward an education ministry? How do I steward an outreach and a justice ministry? I mean, I think if we use stewardship as the describing word rather than the destination of a ministry itself, we think differently about how that ministry is formulated and put together in the life of the church. The other thing I have down here is the last use the broad understanding of stewardship with those who join and are new to the church. Is your greatest opportunity to inject change in the life of the church is creating language with the newest members of your church. It is harder to change the language of someone that's had a definition of stewardship for 30 years versus someone that's brand new to the church and doesn't know what this community's definition of stewardship is. The earlier, a more inclusive definition of stewardship can be given to new members of the church, the greater impact those newer members can have on the culture of the church itself. So we're going to get into a few examples here. So the first example I talked about was broadening the format of stewardship. So I'm going to get out of this document and I'm going to get into another document. Let's see here. Okay. So this is a pledge form that I've used in the last 3 churches I've served. And it is a 3-part pledge form that and this part you're seeing at the top, the monetary pledge. I would say 99% of the churches have something like this and nothing more. This is all there is. There's a pledge for the operating budget, and if there's a capital campaign going on, a pledge for a capital campaign. So typically people fill out their pledge cards, turn it in, and that's the stewardship campaign for the year with some preaching and resources and have small groups or calling or whatever happens, but it's all centered around money. I have found that is a minimalist approach to stewardship campaigns. I have added 2 other pledge processes to this. And so one of the things I've added is a time and talent pledge. And you can see this section on the page. And this is an example of one of the churches I was in of all the ways that someone could be involved in the life of the church. Every ministry I could think of that the church had at the time. And I would have, if it's a family filling it out or an individual filling it out, I want that person to think through in a prayerful way how they want to be involved in the church in the next year with their time and talent. And they will either put their name, or if it's a multiple family, they'll put their initials next to the little dashes to the side of places they want to plug in for the next year. Maybe they want to be a children's sponsor, or they want to be in the Sunrise Choir, or they want to help out with property or whatever it is. They are trying to invest in the ministry life of the church and not just the financial life of the church, which I think is important. And then the final pledge at the bottom is a spiritual growth pledge. And this is kind of individual formation that's going on. And people can check off ways they want to grow their spirit and their faith in the life of the church and in their own life in some way. And I found that this 3-tiered approach to a campaign broadens the understanding of stewardship. They're not just asking for money. They're asking me to reflect on the investment of my entire life in this community of faith. One of the downfalls of only doing a financial pledge every year is the churches that only invite a financial pledge only, people that have a hard time, if they're financially in a difficult spot and can't make a financial pledge, then they feel guilty that they're not able to contribute to the church in some way. And so you can actually have someone feel negatively or shameful about their experience in the church when the pledge, even though it can be an exciting thing to build pledges, some people can feel shamed by just a financial pledge only. Where if it has the time and talent and the spiritual growth pledge, if someone's not personally able to give a large financial gift, but they can give with their time and talent. They can give with their spirit and their growth. They can feel equal partners in their contributions to the life of the church in some way. So hopeful this kind of pledge form can be helpful to you to thinking about expanding even in a defined pledge period, that it's not just about money, it's much more than that, it's more inclusive than that. So I'll just kind of pause and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts about the pledge form.
Chris, I know you'll be shocked to hear from me that you don't have a place on there about their commitment to stewardship of accumulated resources, a commitment to the church's endowment fund.
What are you talking about, Bobby? Yes, that probably should need to be on there as well. I agree with that. Yep. Yep.
Chris, this is Logan. I just wanted to ask, are you able to see the chat on your end? There've been a few people
I
commenting
am
in the
not,
chat.
since I shared screen, I cannot see the chat. So if there's something in the chat, that would be great if you can let me know.
There was some stuff earlier, but I'll make sure to jump in on that if anybody
Okay.
else posts in there.
Okay.
Doug says, I had not seen the third portion before, and that's a great concept.
Okay, good, good. Okay, I'm gonna go back to share screen again. So that was the pledge form. The second part is what I call stewardship language throughout the year. And this is, I'm a person that preaches stewardship all year long. And so I'm a series preacher. So I might do 5 weeks on this, 4 weeks on this, but I would say I easily preach 6 stewardship sermons a year spread out through the year at least, at minimum 6 sermons. And stewardship sermons can be about money, they can be about creation, they can be about community. It's helping expand the church's understanding of stewardship. And so if I preach on different themes of stewardship throughout the year, I am moving stewardship away from a seasonal 1 or 2 month period in the year to something that's talked about, reflected on throughout the year, just from a preaching perspective. So I think it's important for ministers to do that. The other thing I found with my clergy friends, how many of them have not been very good givers historically. And so stewardship preaching becomes difficult for the minister to preach about when they're not practicing stewardship. And so that's where that, to me, where stewardship of self comes in. If I'm going to be preaching about stewardship, I need to reflect that with my own life in some way. And so if I'm going to preach these things, I better be living these things. And so I think it's important to have stewardship of self to be able to do the sermon work itself. The other is church liturgy. Of these 6 themes I've brought up on stewardship, allowing the liturgy, responsive readings, unison prayers, hymns, all the liturgy of the church throughout the year should highlight themes of stewardship. I think that stuff's really important to do. If we only use stewardship language around a stewardship pledge period, we are doing the church a disservice by not being more inclusive throughout the entire year. I mentioned earlier the use of steward language, evaluating your ministry. How are we being stewards of our education ministry? How are we being stewards of our worship ministry? How are we being stewards of our outreach ministry? Or are we being good stewards of our church resources? I mean, using stewardship as a describer word, not as a destination word. And then the last thing I would say, I mentioned earlier about training new people, is new people that enter the life of the church, what kind of documentation we give them. Most churches have a new member packet or some kind of new member documentation they hand to people. And I'm going to share with you a document that I use with regularity in a new member packet. And it's this, just being a steward of God's mission. This is in every new member packet I give out to a person or family that joins the church. And it's just a document that describes what it means to be a steward. It goes down to stewardship is about being a Christian community with one another. It's a place where we're blessed with gifts and the church blesses us with gifts. And I go on to describe what I call the 6 concepts of stewardship: self, time, creation, Sabbath, community, and resources. And I invite people to broaden their framework of that word. And so this document is one I put in new member packets. So when they're looking at stewardship materials, I try to define for people from the very beginning when they join the church what it means to be a steward of God's creation and a steward in the church itself.
Chris, Bobby said in the chat, when you say the minister needs to be practicing stewardship, at the Christian Church Foundation, we say, don't ask others to do what you are not committed to doing yourself.
Yep. Yep. Totally agree. So, I will say this about stewardship. People get excited about thriving ministry and not sinking ships. When you communicate throughout the life of the church in a given year, the church needs to be celebrating all the work the church does. So a picture on the left here is a picture of me going down with a group of women and one man down to Mexico when we could go to Mexico when it was safe. We did building of homes in the colonias along the Texas and Mexico border. And we came back and showed pictures and saying, you know, when we make gifts to the church, this is the kind of ministry that we're doing. And showing pictures, celebrating stories, talking about stories, communicating that in newsletters, announcements on Sunday mornings, highlights in various ways. When you're having fellowship events, have someone do a moment of celebration of some ministry in the life of the church, continuing to tell stories. People give to thriving, celebratory stories of things that churches are doing. The sinking ship is the example of, we need you to give because we got to pay the water bill this month. Or you need to give because we're $10,000 behind. We got to make budget. That doesn't inspire people. We're not inspired by being behind and giving to utility bills and necessary things. All those things got to be covered. We got to pay the light bill. We've got to pay the gas bill, but that's typically not the best motivator. What motivates people is mission, not obligation. And so as we think about stewardship and giving, we want to get people thinking about thriving ministry and not sinking ships. Oops. The other thing I would say is the power of gratitude. Saying thank you. There is nothing more powerful than being able to say thank you to a person or persons. We had in this COVID-19, we've had an outside service. We've been doing outside services. We do recorded services on Sundays. We've had occasional outside services. And we did a prayer service outside and had about 10 people volunteer to help me with that prayer service. As soon as that prayer service was over, I wrote a handwritten thank you note to all 10 of those volunteers and said, I want to say thank you, how much I appreciated you taking the time out to help with the service, helping it come off and be meaningful service. Your time, your effort was really important. Thank you for doing that. So I'm a huge thank you note person or a gratitude person. Or if I find out that someone has made a $5,000 gift to the church, if we don't say thank you for that, they're very likely not going to give that gift again in the future. We've got to find some way to say thank you to people that make a contribution. You know, one of the interesting things that's difficult in churches, we oftentimes have kind of a veil of secrecy around money in churches. We don't want to know what each other give, and I think that's important. But I think some people need to know what people give so that gratitude can be shared. If someone is making a $10,000 gift to the youth ministry of the church and no one says inkling about that gift, they're going to never know if that gift meant anything or what made an impact in some way. But if there's a handful of people that know about the gift, if a letter was sent, this is going to make a huge impact on youth ministry. With these dollars, we can do a mission trip. With these dollars, we can have the kids do community service in our local community. We're going to be able to provide them resources and education materials we wouldn't be able to purchase otherwise. And to say thank you for that is only going to inspire future giving. So it could be a thank you for a monetary contribution. It could be a thank you for time well spent or an effort of behind the scenes work. All that is huge to say gratitude to someone when it comes to it's enculturating a spirit of stewardship within the life of the whole church. The last thing I would say is authentic spirituality and stewardship embodies these 4 words: intentionality, consistency, embodiment, and communal. If we're not intentional about the work we do, we are haphazard about the work we do. If we are not consistent with doing something with regularity, it won't ever get done. Embodiment is not a checkoff list, it's a state of being. And communal is we do this work together. It's not done, the church is not, if a church worships 100 people, it's not 100 people, it's one body working together that's made up of 100 people. But it's not 100 people in the room, it is one body in the room. We are communal, doing this work united with one another. And so to me, authentic spirituality and stewardship incorporates all 4 of these things working side by side with one another. So I'm going to stop there and get off screen, and I'm just going to pause. We've got about 10 minutes. So I'm just going to, that's my presentation for the day. And I'm just going to let people dialogue, have Q&A, whatever you'd like to talk about. We've got 10 minutes to do whatever you'd like to talk about at this point.
This is Steve Thompson. I appreciate what you said about the gratitude. One of the things that I used to do when I was minister in church was to do the financial campaign with the board of directors first, and then to take the mean contribution as a standard to give to the congregation and celebrate what the board of directors were doing. It helped to set a standard for contribution. It also helped the board of directors to understand their role, which traditionally board of directors' role is to either give, get, or get off in terms of financial support for an organization.
Stephen, on your last part, your volume, my internet went unstable a little bit. And can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know whether everybody heard me or not. If you didn't.
Service to the whole church.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to kind of get some leads. I think if you can have some examples of leadership, if you can get someone that says, we've done this is the starting place, we want you to join with us in this effort, versus it's kind of having the same starting place. I think kind of a tiered approach can be helpful.
Chris, how do you engage, and I put it in the chat, how do you engage resistors to stewardship as you're looking at the model that you're using for people in your congregation?
So people that are not as excited about doing this kind of thing?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. You know, you're always going to have a few people that they've kind of got their mind, they come with they've had a scar from a previous church experience or whatever it is that has they're kind of hesitant around that process.
Mm-hmm.
I found that the best way to shift resistors, it doesn't happen immediately, it happens over time. It's done through pastoral care, is my best response to resistors. And so if I know that certain people are resistors, that might just be intentional about scheduling conversations with those people over a period of time, talking to them about the life of the church and how they're involved in the church and what contributions they make, and share gratitude for things they've done. And then try to share some of the visions of the mission of the church as a whole. Maybe some of the visions I have for the church, or some of the visions the congregation has set forth in terms of goals or aspirations the church wants to do. But if you can get them on board with some of those kind of things on a one-on-one basis, it's much better than send them a letter saying, you haven't given a pledge card, you need to turn it in. That's only going to create more division with someone. To me, the impact is creating one-on-one pastoral conversations with people to kind of get a little better understanding of where they're coming from, where you're coming from, and finding some common ground with each other. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
That is, thank you.
This is Steve Thompson. One other thing I would add is one of the things that oftentimes churches do in stewardship is focus solely on giving as it relates to the church. Many of these people who are not financially supportive of the church are altruistic in terms of their support of other organizations. And I think if stewardship is framed within a larger context of the society and what we're doing, we celebrate what people are doing and their contributions beyond the church as well as the church. I think it bodes well for the stewardship campaign of the church.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And a lot of my preaching on when I've shared financial stuff with financial, I always share that I'm a tither to the church, but I often share organizations that I've supported as well that have been important to my own life or things that I believe in, and that our stewardship is a totality of not just church alone, but all the things that we're contributing to. I think how we share those things make a huge difference.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Chris, this is Allison again. You spoke about the theology of sufficiency. Is there a resource or, a book or some other resource that you could point us to?
You would put me on the spot like that, Allison.
I'm sorry. You don't have to tell us now. I mean, I just thought maybe you had a book behind you you could pull off the shelf and show me.
I wish I could do that. There,
Okay.
the workshop. The workshop I was at 2 years ago, it was actually a sermon preached by an American Baptist. And I thought, I need to get a copy of that sermon at least. You might be able to pull some stuff. A person that talks about the theology of abundance a lot, but I think there's some sufficiency language in it is Walter Brueggemann.
Okay.
He pretty much talks about abundance, but I think if you looked at the nuances of some of his wording, you would find some sufficiency components underneath that.
Okay. I just love that so much. I mean, I've used, theology of abundance for years, and I love sufficiency so much more. So thank you for that.
It's kind of my new theology phrase for this kind of thinking anyways.
Yeah, I like it. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Good. All right.
And for those,
this is DC from Louisiana. I was just thinking when she said that Walter Brueggemann had a book come out last year or early this year called Materiality as Resistance, 5 Elements for Moral Action in the Real World. And those were, it kind of was along that line. It just clicked with me when you said that he really in that book talks about how we don't have to live as paupers, but it's our job to give back our excess because that's how we all live.
Yeah.
So,
that's good. So it has all those hints of sufficiency under abundance, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
That's good.
I told Nadine earlier that the PowerPoint presentation that I used today, the sample pledge card, and then the document I used for new members, all that will be available to the region for anybody to access later on if people want to go back and have access to those materials.
That's great stuff. Great. Awesome. Get that.
Any other questions or thoughts from people?
This has been great. It's enlightening. Thank you so much.
So I hope people will take away, and it should be pretty evident that this authentic approach to things, as I've thought about that word authentic, it's really a way of life, embodying a way of life rather than a program or an initiative. It's much broader than that. And the more we can get the congregation to think about stewardship as a way of life, I think we create a greater opportunity for deeper health in our congregations.
Yeah, it's something to think about.
So in the chat, I don't know if you can see it or not, but Nerlene Anderson said, let us know when you write your book on the theology of sufficiency.
I see that.
Wonderful. It's been great. Timely.
Well, Nadine, we're at 9:59. I did okay. So.
I was just saying, this has been great. It's timely, and it's needed. So thank you so much for sharing with us. I think we have some things to think about as a region as we look at stewardship in our congregations and even on the regional level. And so you really put a different spin on authentic spirituality and stewardship. Authentic spirituality is one of the region's value statements.
Okay, cool.
And so that's where that springs from. And so
Okay,
thank you for
okay.
helping to round that out for us as we think about what it means to practice stewardship.
Well, Nadine, feel free to pass on my email address to anybody too. If someone wants to individually reach out to me, I'd be glad to visit with someone about things.
We will. Thank you so much. It's been
All
great. All right.
Hey, Chris, Nadine, just real quick for anybody on this call, I assume they're here to gain Chris's wonderful knowledge and sharing for one, but secondly, just to have an idea of good stewardship resources. And I would take this moment to put a plug in, as Bobby did earlier, for another Disciples of Christ ministry in the Christian Board of Publication, or Chalice Press, which also has resources on stewardship, one of which being Community of Prayer by Bruce Barkauer, but there's also others there. So you could use the chalicepress.com as an opportunity to find more resources on stewardship.
Thank you. Great resource by Bruce Barkauer. Bruce is the director for the Center of Faith and Giving, and so that whole other expansive on stewardship for the larger denomination. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anything else? So Chris, thank you so much. We will take 15 minutes, is that correct? And come back with our second workshop. Logan, do you want them to sign off and sign back on, or can they stay on?
No, you can absolutely stay on. And I think
great.
Dr. Whitehall just entered. Sorry, somebody muted me.
To go to Ronnie Nowell's.
Blessings, everyone.